It's been another crazy month for aviation in February, and like always, this video will provide you with an overview of the stories you might have missed and the huge ones that you definitely haven't. Now, this was filmed before we received some of the updates that you now know about, so they will be covered at a later stage. And since we're now increasing the output with a few extra videos per month, I have asked my good friend and fellow Boeing 737 typewriting examiner, Ben, to help me present some of them to you. So please give him a warm Mentour welcome. Here he is.
It's another day and another month, which means that once again, it's time for another look at what you might have missed in aviation during the past few weeks. Today, I'm continuing our monthly recap series, where we put the now in Mentour Now, by looking at some stories that may not be big enough to have in their own video, at least not yet. Or these could be stories that are maybe still evolving and will get their own video later on, but are maybe worth keeping an eye on, so stay tuned. Now first, I have to look at something that actually happened back in January, but was a bit too late for us to capture in our previous roundup, which was actually just as well, since the story got much more interesting in February. Now this was Boom Supersonic and their first supersonic flight of their XB-1 aircraft. This jet is a single-seat experimental testbed that Boom are using as an intermediate step in developing the first supersonic airliner to fly since the retirement of Concorde over 20 years ago. Now, we've already made a video on Boom's work a few years ago, looking at some of the challenges the company has to overcome to make this project a reality. Size-wise, the Overture will be quite similar to Concorde, and before changing from its original 3-engine layout to the 4-engine layout it has now, it actually had a very Concorde-like wing. But the new configuration and engine placement is actually a little bit more like some of the renderings of Boeing's old 2707 Supersonic Transport, or SST. The Overture is planned to have seats for between 64 and 80 passengers according to Boom, and claims to have orders and pre-orders for 130 aircraft, from American Airlines, United and Japan Airlines. Initially there was also some interest in Virgin, but that seems to be over. Now, there is more to say about those orders and in general how we define firm orders and options, but that's a longer story that I could cover in a future update on Boom. The news is now about the company's first plane, the XB-1. In previous years, the progress around the aircraft had been a bit slow, to put it mildly. The plane's rollout took place in October of 2020, and back then, the first flight was expected in 2021, and that obviously didn't happen. The first taxi test didn't take place until 2023, with the first flight finally coming in almost a year ago in March 2024. Now, it only lasted 12 minutes, and then after a gap of a few months, the second flight took place last August. Boom then slowly started extending their flight testing, flying longer and higher until the 28th of January this year, where their plane flew for the 12th time for just over half an hour. The aircraft broke the sound barrier 3 times in that flight, reaching Mach 1.1 before coming back in for a safe landing. The company then repeated that feat on the 10th of February with a slightly longer flight reaching Mach 1.12. But there were some extra points in this story. Firstly, that second supersonic flight was the last ever planned flight of the XB-1. The aircraft will now be retired, and Boom eventually plans to display it in the lobby of its headquarters in Denver, Colorado. Secondly, Boom announced that the last time its test aircraft flew, it demonstrated that it could fly supersonically boomless. The company explains that as long as the speed is between Mach 1 and 1.3 or so, and provided that the atmospheric conditions are right, and that the aircraft is flying high enough, the boom doesn't reach the ground. Now that is actually something that NASA's own supersonic demonstrator is going to explore later this year. Boom used microphone arrays specifically made for this testing to validate its results. And this could make it possible for the Overture to fly supersonically over land without a sonic boom. But that will mean flying no faster than Mach 1.3, when the plane's planned cruise speed is actually Mach 1.7. So flying over water will still be preferable. But even at the lower speed, the aircraft will be much faster than conventional airliners. Now, making any of this happen would require changes in legislation to allow supersonic flights if the atmospheric conditions and other factors like the size of the aircraft allow it to fly boomless at those lower supersonic speeds. Again, there's more challenges to make Boom Overture fly with passengers, which I'll probably cover in a separate video. Now, my next story is about much more normal looking aircraft, because there's still some uneasiness about the future of a few airlines in the United States, and many of them have been exploring different ways to secure their future. On that front, one interesting story that happened recently is that JetBlue and United Airlines may be pursuing some sort of partnership, with some media suggesting that United could actually buy JetBlue. Now, these rumours started on social media late last January and immediately drew everyone's interest, for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, we already knew that JetBlue might be on the lookout for such a partnership. We've explained in a few videos on this channel how low-cost and leisure airlines in the US have had to rethink the way they operate in recent years. And a number of low-cost and ultra-low-cost carriers like Spirit, Frontier, and more recently Southwest are slowly transitioning from a pure low-cost model to something a bit more conventional by adding more seat options and other perks. Now, there's obviously a lot more to a low-cost carrier's operation than seating, baggage, and food options, but I'm not going to go into that here. The point here is that US air travel, particularly in domestic routes, is becoming increasingly competitive, which is why JetBlue has been pursuing a number of partnerships in recent years. Petter has talked in other videos about JetBlue's partnership with American Airlines for routes in northeastern United States, and about their decision to buy Spirit Airlines, and how both of these moves were stopped by regulators on competitive grounds. That's why some sort of link between United and JetBlue seemed plausible from JetBlue's point of view. But United was quick to issue a denial about those rumours. They actually made a filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission just for this issue, which seemed a bit of a strong reaction for a post that someone made on X and Blue Sky. Now, United is actually doing pretty well financially thanks to some strong demand for international travel, so they don't really want to upset that nice, healthy image for investors, which is actually why not everyone was fully convinced that they're not talking with JetBlue at all. But other US airlines have definitely been talking about mergers, and they haven't been keeping it a secret either. With JetBlue's efforts to buy Spirit now quashed, Frontier have been having a go at doing the same thing. And Frontier was actually courting Spirit before JetBlue over 2 years ago, and Spirit's management actually preferred Frontier because the two airlines were more alike and such a merger was thought to be less risky. But despite this, a new deal in 2025 was always going to be harder than before. Spirit's value as an airline is far lower now than it was 2 years ago because of a general drop in demand for or overcapacity in key routes, and trouble to do with engine problems, as we've covered in other videos. In the end though, despite Frontier being really keen on buying Spirit, and the fact that today regulators would probably look at this deal more favourably, it didn't happen. Spirit's board decided to continue the airline's ongoing restructuring alone. Politically, mergers have been a contentious topic in the United States, with the previous government being seen as sceptical towards them, something that many observers expect to change with the new administration. And that means that these stories could actually look quite different when you read about them in the news, depending on which outlet you depend on. Now, in more disturbing aviation news, we had another accident in February, this time in Canada. We already released a quick reaction video on the accident of the Endeavour Air CRJ900 that happened in Toronto on Monday the 17th, while the aircraft and its crew were operating Delta Airlines Flight 4819. Since then, the Canadian authorities have recovered the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, and obviously the investigation is ongoing. In total, 21 people on board the aircraft had to be taken to hospital, but within about a day of the crash, all but 2 of them were released. And those 2 did not face life-threatening injuries, which, if you've seen the videos of this crash, seems like a miracle.
That whole story and its potentially devastating consequences really shows how important it is with transparency when things like that happens. And we only really get that when we get to see the same story from multiple different angles. And that's why I am so happy to have Ground News as the sponsor of this video. Just check out ground.news/mentor to compare the NTSB report on this accident alongside with all of the different media perspectives on it, with their ownership, credibility and bias. It's really quite fascinating. Exactly because of news like this, Ground News has been my go-to app and website for tracking breaking aviation stories, since they immediately provide me with multiple angles, which gives me more info than any single article ever could. I have seen your comments on how frustrated you are with the sensationalism and lack of context in today's media landscape, and I can't emphasize enough how powerful a tool Ground News can be to tackle that. You can also use them to track your favorite topic, whether that's aviation, tech, or even politics. So to try it out yourself, go to ground.news/mentor or scan this QR code. That will give you almost half price on the Vantage plan that I've been using for years. That's only $5 per month to keep yourself properly informed and help support this independent platform, as well as me.
Also in February, we got more updates from the NTSB about details on the mid-air collision over Washington, D.C. and the PSA CRJ-700 that was flying for American Airlines and a US Army helicopter. Unlike what we were told previously, the military helicopter and the airliner were talking with air traffic control on VHF, but on different frequencies. ATC was simultaneously transmitting to both of them, but the pilots could only hear the ATC transmissions, not each other. Now, the NTSB explained that the helicopter crew may have missed a couple of critical parts of the transmission from ATC. One of these was the instruction to pass behind the CRJ. One of the helicopter pilots keyed his push-to-talk button too quickly and blocked or stepped on the controller's transmission. Now, these kind of radio issues are known, and they were a factor in some famous accidents, most notably the Tenerife airport disaster, which Petter covered over on the Mentor Pilot channel. There are ways to mitigate these kinds of problems, and I'm sure the NTSB will examine what went wrong in this case. The cockpit voice recorder in the helicopter also indicated that there was a difference of approximately 100 feet in altitude between the altimeters that the two pilots were using. The pilot's radio altimeter that was measuring their height over the ground was working correctly though. But as it turns out, the radio altimeter was the only altimeter that the flight data recorder of this helicopter was recording, which means that their investigators have an extra challenge as they try to figure out why there was a difference between the other altimeters and how the pilots used them. The NTSB also believes that the helicopter pilots were wearing night vision goggles because this was a training flight and the use of these goggles was one of the check items in their training. The goggles could be a factor here because they can restrict the pilot's field of view and their depth perception. Finally, the NTSB brought up something else regarding the published routes that this helicopter was following. The maximum altitude of the route was 200 feet above ground level at that key position near the airport, but the horizontal or lateral boundaries of that route were not defined. The thickness of the blue lines representing the routes didn't correspond to those boundaries, something that the NTSB clearly felt is worth highlighting here, especially since the vertical separation of the helicopter route and the approach path of the runway 33 at Ronald Reagan Airport was so marginal. Anyway, it's time to switch over to some good news. And even better, this is good Boeing news. In February, we learned that Boeing delivered 45 aircraft in the first month of the year, as opposed to just 30 aircraft in January 2024. Now, those of you who are really paying attention might point out here that the Alaska Airlines MAX 9 door plug blowout happened in early January last year, and clearly impacted deliveries for that month, and many months after that. But crucially, the last time Boeing delivered this many aircraft in a January was actually in 2019, before the second MAX crash, which changed so much around Boeing, including its 737 production rates. And this is actually quite impressive when you consider that Boeing are still recovering from the effects of their worker strike last autumn, and the long time they took to restart production after the strike. Now, a few weeks ago, we made a video specifically to highlight that really slow production restart after the strike, at a time when Boeing customers desperately needed new aircraft. And we said that we really hope that this deliberate decision was a way for the company to fix problems and start their recovery, finally. Well, as it turns out, this may well be what's happening. Avalon, one of Boeing's biggest customers and the second biggest leaser in the world, said that Boeing has made some impressive progress since that strike. It's not just Boeing's delivery numbers that Avalon likes. Avalon CEO Andy Cronin said that Boeing now has an impressive level of clarity and visibility in its production that is really encouraging. A number of investors and funds seem to agree that Boeing's outlook is getting better because they're increasing their stakes in the company for the first time since before that door plug blowout. Now, Airbus, on the other hand, had a relatively slow start to the year, delivering just 22 aircraft in January, down from 30 the year before. So now one question for industry watchers is whether the suppliers that Boeing and Airbus depend on can actually ramp up production fast enough to keep up with both of them, since the two manufacturers share many of these suppliers. But for Boeing, that's probably a good problem to have, considering the amount of challenges that they're recovering from. In other news, Airbus are pushing ahead with plans to offer a military version of their A320 family for a maritime role. Boeing already have the P-8 Poseidon for the US Navy and other customers, which is basically a heavily modified 737-800 that has anti-submarine and maritime patrol capabilities. And as it turns out, Airbus want to do something similar, but with a couple of twists. Firstly, unlike the P-8, which is based on the previous generation of the 737 instead of the new MAX, Airbus want to base their maritime aircraft on the Neo, the newer and more efficient version of the aircraft. Secondly, even though Airbus initially wanted to use the A320neo itself as their naval platform, their newest plans call for using the longer A321 and more specifically the A321XLR. This is a version with extra structural fuel tanks in the fuselage, and the regular commercial variant of this plane only entered service a few months ago. Airbus call this aircraft the A321 MPA for Maritime Patrol Aircraft, and have been promoting it to the French Defence Procurement Agency, who are looking to replace their old turboprop maritime aircraft. Military markets like these have been a small but potentially lucrative market for aircraft manufacturers, because these jets have much higher profit margins than typical commercial airliners. And compared to Boeing, Airbus have been relatively slow in tapping into this market. The war in Ukraine and the events that followed have pushed up military spending globally in recent years, so the importance of this market is growing quite quickly. So this is another area where Airbus may be trying to steal customers away from Boeing. Well, we'll see. And finally, speaking of commercial aircraft that are used for new military roles, we saw some strange news in February concerning the next Air Force One. On the 15th, the US President decided to have a tour of a VIP Boeing 747-8 that just happened to be parked at the Palm Beach International Airport in Florida. That particular aircraft was actually 12 years old and was originally built for the royal family of Qatar, but it now belongs to a company in the Isle of Man. The purpose of that visit seemed a bit unclear. We know that the next Air Force One, or VC-25B, as it will officially be known, will be a 747-8. Well, actually two of them. But of course, those jets will be purpose-built for the US President's use, so their configuration won't necessarily share much with that VIP jet. 3 days later came some related news, that the Air Force One program is facing new delays. Originally, the first of the jets should have entered service in 2024, but that date was pushed back to 2027 or possibly even 2028. These new delays meant that, according to the White House, the next Air Force One jets might not be ready before 2029 or even later. And if that's the case, the current president may not have the chance to use them. As we've explained in a previous video, Boeing's delays have to do with supplier issues, with changing contracts, and with funding issues, since this is a fixed price contract that Boeing agreed to back in 2018, so they have to pay out of pocket for any new costs. On top of this, the US Air Force has added new requirements for the security features of these aircraft because of the lessons learned from recent conflicts and emerging technologies around the world. In January, Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg said that the US president wants the plane sooner, but he added that he would talk with Elon Musk about the cost of the program and any way to speed up the schedule. But Boeing directed any press questions about that schedule to the customer, the US Air Force. So these are the stories for today, guys. I know that there's other very important aviation developments that emerged in February, including the state of the air traffic control, for example, but I think that's a story that deserves its own video. But what else did you see happen in the last month that you think I should cover? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. My name's Ben Watts, you're watching Mentour Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.